According to a 2003 report from the International Justice Mission, an estimated 60% of the 25,000 to 35,000 prostitutes in the Dominican Republic enter the sex industry as minors. Since then, the number of children being exploited has continued to grow. Today, the Dominican Republic is known as a global hotspot for sex tourism, an unregulated market that brings about physical dangers and emotional challenges for vulnerable sex workers and has varying economic effects on the Dominican travel industry. Considering the Dominican government and travel industry, Western sex tourists, and the international community lack initiative to take action in addressing the struggles faced by these vulnerable groups, who should take on the responsibility of regulating sex tourism in the Dominican Republic? SEXCAPADE, the impact of unregulated sex tourism on vulnerable groups in the Dominican Republic. Tourism in the Dominican Republic currently makes up about 17% of the country's gross domestic product. An increase in globalism and transnational desires have led to exponential growth in Dominican tourism and have resulted in the creation of a booming sex tourism market. Transnational desires refer to differences in status, wealth, and race among people and how tourists and workers idolize the other across borders. Sex tourism in DR is now one of the fastest growing sectors of what can only be described as the informal Dominican economy, and has led to the creation of the Dominican Republic's brand as a sexual paradise among the international community. The establishment of the sex tourism market in this third world country can be traced back to colonial times, in which civilized Westerners created the image of exotic Dominicans and thus materialized a Western demand for sexual fantasies with locals on the island. Transnational sexual desires have produced this demand for sex tourism, further supported by the normalization of the country's perceived hypersexuality. Moreover, the supply and demand of the sex tourism market in the country continues as local sex workers remain in need of basic incomes and strive to survive in a highly impoverished country. As it seems that the demand and supply of unregulated sex tourism in the Dominican Republic isn't going to stop anytime soon, the vulnerable groups involved may continue to suffer. That raises the question, what are the vulnerable groups affected by unregulated sex tourism in the Dominican Republic? Sex worker groups especially vulnerable to sex tourism include children, Haitian immigrants, and the transgender community.
Of course, we're talking about vulnerable groups in society because these are the poorest groups in Dominican society. And those vulnerabilities are determined not necessarily just by the social status or the amount of money they have or they don't have, but it is determined. It's an intersectionality there. Like, it has to do with social status, it has to do with race, it has to do with sexual orientation and gender. So, the transgender community, the Black community, the poor community, it's a kind of palimpsest that goes together, and it's an intersection of elements.
I have seen and read research of women going into the Dominican Republic and have sexual relations with the local people. It's an individual choice for a lot of women and a lot of men, but it's also a structural situation, a situation of structural violence that they have been placed in within the global economy and within a global system of white supremacy that relegates people of color into these sexualized positions.
Children as young as 11 years old are at risk of physical and psychological harm, and the effects that come along with it, such as vaginal tearing, unwanted pregnancy, and depression. When it comes to Haitian immigrants and transgender individuals' involvement, around 80% of Haitian female sex workers have reported experiencing violence during their sex transactions. Transgender individuals often suffer from risk behavior measures as they cope with the stigma that casts their ethnicity and sexual orientation in a negative light.
Very obvious that they were the poorest of the poor, the trans women. And I learned after that most trans women don't make it past 35 in Latin America.
Unregulated sex tourism in DR can also be said to affect another vulnerable group, the travel industry.
Unfortunately, Sosua in the north coast of the Dominican Republic has been a sore spot for sort of the Dominican government's PR about their tourist sector. And
so I wouldn't define them vulnerable groups. And I'm not sure they would suffer either. Because, you know, the saying in Spanish, echa la ley, hecho el engaño. I think these are already under the cover, under the table kind of businesses that they would find a way to keep existing.
Considering the current profit-based system seems to be unregulated, the question remains, what are the shortcomings of the current policies that would be used to address sex tourism?
In theory, you'll find them. In the practice, they're not effective at all, because in no situation a police officer would persecute or punish the tourist.
Police have an important role. They're like the pimp of the state in this, and they're often invisible, I think, when we think about sex tourism. So the police are involved in coercion and economic exploitation of women, and also sexual and sexual violence, and just bodily violence against the women.
I see how tourists are worshipped because they are the capital, the money, and they don't want to mess up with that. Also because the majority of owners of all these resorts, beach resorts, are not Dominicans.
these, plans over the years of changing Sosua into some different kind of town by, ridding the streets of any sign of the sex sector is, it just results in doing harm.
Considering the existing atmosphere, what would be the first step to protect the vulnerable groups affected by unregulated sex tourism?
I think the answer is to begin with the laws that are not in place. And that requires not just laws, but also, more job opportunities, more career opportunities, a better education, especially in DR. Like education in DR, like school education, is very, very bad.
Be great for them to strengthen their human infrastructure, education and healthcare and housing and food. If you strengthen the population, that will tend to minimize the sex trade. Do a stint of prostitution, of sex work on the weekend, and you could make the same amount or more money than you spent the whole month working and having to suffer all those humiliations.
It's hard to see in the bigger picture how unregulated sex tourism can be regulated if you don't care enough about your population, because you don't provide career opportunities, money to survive, a decent job to have a decent life, homes, and a right education.
Sex tourism, or the sex sector, if you will, in tourist spaces is a source of income for a lot of folks. And I don't think it should be regulated per se. I think, that like any other labor sector, people should be able to choose the kind of work they want to do and be free from being criminalized and policed.
Seeing as the neoliberalist Dominican government remains inactive in its address to sex tourism, others argue through the assistance of NGOs and other countries. Nonetheless, because some NGOs and countries may lack the financial resources or influence for this cause, their help seems to only be effective if several of them unite together on the issue. Because Western sex tourists are the monopsonists of the unregulated sex tourism in the Dominican Republic, some may argue that they should be partly responsible for the sex market's regulation.
La industria, lo que ustedes llaman turismo sexual, no es un renglón propiamente de un turismo dominicano, es un renglón que ha sido introducido al país por personas de procedencia extranjera. Entonces, si Estados Unidos tiene oficinas que colaboran con ellos o departamentos que colaboran con ellos en los países del tercer mundo, pues Estados Unidos asimismo debería tener algún tipo de contacto más abierto con algún departamento de esos países que le informen sobre las actividades delictivas de índole sexual en que incurren sus ciudadanos y Estados Unidos procesarlo.
The history of Western intervention in Latin America and in most of the world has given us very complicated problems because imperialism is always about the needs and the domination and superiority of the Western nations. That whole missionary impulse of going into poor nations and trying to save the souls of the people there because they're backward and uncivilized. I think we need to give up on that script.
Who should take on responsibilities? Everybody, including, I was also thinking on the other side, including the tourists, but that is something that should happen, I don't know, worldwide, like how to educate people to be travelers and to be respectful of different.
With the help of NGOs and other countries, tourists should also be on the front lines in making an effort to address the unregulated sex tourism market and ensure the collective well-being of themselves and the vulnerable groups involved in the market.